Hey everybody, my name is Fritz Battcher. I'm a corporate partner at Holland and Hart here in Reno, Nevada. I specialize in mergers and acquisitions, startup companies, financing, anything business. Um, Today, I am going to talk about what I've seen during COVID and how it has affected mergers and acquisitions and deals here in Northern Nevada, and across sort of the U.S. generally. I will. Oh, hey, Craig. I will. I'll just be talking about some things that I've seen, what I think's happening, and some of the differences now that are happening in deals that maybe weren't happening quite as much before COVID. My speech is very sort of informal, so please jump in because I love participation. I love questions. So with this size of group, don't hesitate just to unmute yourself and to pop in and ask a question, and we can talk about whatever, because it's only valuable to you if I'm answering the questions that you're interested in. So with that said, Holland and Hart is one of Reno's largest law firms, Nevada's largest law firms. We are in the Intermountain West. We have over 400 attorneys in about 18 different offices in 7 states. So we're a full service law firm and can help businesses of all sizes and with any sort of legal need they may have. So COVID obviously has wreaked havoc on not only our economy, but how we've interacted and deals in general. The first quarter of 2020 was pretty rough for deal work in the US. It was already low. I think the effects from Europe of COVID and people being nervous about what was going to happen made deal work in the first quarter of 2020 one of the lowest it's been in years in the United States. But in the second quarter of 2020, it was a 40% drop from the first quarter of 2020, which was already pretty bad. So that second quarter, when COVID hit here and everyone was worried about it, almost all deals came to a screeching halt. I had 3 deals that I was doing in March of 2020, and all 3 of those at that time went off. And so that was pretty typical. So that people stopped, they didn't know what was happening. They were concerned about, all the things like, what am I buying? How is this company going to react? When's the economy going to open up? All sort of the insecurities and questions that you can recall that we had. So deal work really came to a screeching halt. But by the end of the summer, it started picking up. We started seeing some of the deals come back, and then certain businesses and certain segments of the industry really started being attractive to acquirers. We saw small family-owned businesses be mainly the target for a lot of add-on acquisitions. Companies that had synergies to bigger companies were great targets, and so we started seeing a lot of uptick. And now I feel that we're actually very, very busy. I feel the firm, at least my firm, and even here in the Reno office in particular, our deal work right now is really high, and we're very busy. So that is good news. I think from that perspective, we're back and there's a lot of opportunities. I think a lot of larger companies who have saved cash find this a good opportune time to buy other companies, smaller companies. So if you're a family-owned business looking to be acquired, if you're in a segment that was an essential business and you fared well through COVID, these are the type of companies that are being acquired right now. I do both buy side and sell side, so you can ask any questions about those different perspectives. But mainly when I'm talking about kind of deal work and being prepared right now, I'm going to be talking about it from the sell side perspective. What you would do as an owner of a company to be prepared to do a deal now, still with the effects of COVID lingering, and what has changed. And there's been things that have changed. So one of the very first things that you might notice if you've done deals before, and one of the very most important things when you're doing a deal, is the valuation of your company. How much is someone going to pay for you? And that's probably the biggest negotiation point between a buyer and a seller. And so that process has become a bit more timely, and the buyer has been scrutinizing your financial statements and your business maybe more rigorously than they did pre-COVID. And so that's a big difference that we've been seeing now. Buyers really are digging through financial statements. They're really paying attention to pre-COVID financial statements, and then your financial statements during COVID, to really try to figure out what happened during this time, because they need to identify, when they think you might come back. Is this just a blip and really due to COVID, or was the company having problems, pre-COVID, and this is just an excuse? And so there's a lot of scrutiny of financial statements right now, and the due diligence process and valuation.
Fritz, have you seen a quantified adjustment that factors in COVID?
Well, I haven't seen a quantified. I mean, it certainly happens, and that's a great segue to where I was going next. But what I do see happening in almost every situation, I don't think I've done a deal that this hasn't happened, is that the parties are farther apart in their valuations. The buyer is thinking one thing and discounting because of COVID and because financial statements don't look as strong. The seller saying it's just COVID, it's going to be better. It's going to be better. So we have this gap in valuation, and when we have a gap in valuation, how typically it's addressed is through what I call an earnout process. The buyer and the seller agree that, over a certain period of time after the deal closes, the seller can earn more consideration, can earn more money from the deal. And earnouts are very typical in deals. But now in COVID, those earnouts have become a lot more important, and it have happened in every instance that I've done here in Nevada. And I know on a national trend that earnouts are very common right now in deals. So that's just a way to bridge a gap. If you think your company's worth 10 million, the buyer thinks it's worth 8 million, you're 2 million short. And so how do you bridge that gap? You say, okay, fine, we'll sell it for 8 million at close, but over the next year, 2 years, whatever you negotiate, if I hit certain milestones, or if I hit certain thresholds, which are usually economic, but it can be anything. All this is negotiated, so it can be anything. But it's typically an economic threshold. It's typically an EBITDA number or a profit number. If I hit this, then the buyer's going to pay me more money once I hit those thresholds, up to certain amounts. Maybe it's capped at 10 million, maybe it's capped at 12 million, maybe it's uncapped. So all of that stuff is 100% negotiated. But because of that, the negotiation and coming to those terms, it just takes longer. It takes longer for the business people to agree. It takes longer for the lawyers to agree. It takes longer for the lawyers and the business people to agree. So in general, the main thing about COVID is made things just take longer to do. And earnouts being an important factor. In that valuation and in the due diligence process, COVID, people are paying more attention to who your vendors and suppliers are, because, maybe your business might be doing great, but is a product or something that you need to get from a vendor or supplier, is that company now in trouble or suffering because of the effects of COVID? So the due diligence is going a little bit deeper and looking into your relationships that you have with other parties, with contracts with other parties. Whereas pre-COVID, that might have been just, oh, okay, I see that's who your vendor is. Great. But now it might be, okay, that's your main vendor. We need to get their financial statements, and we need to have you get them to give us some due diligence material, so we can make sure that if we buy you, that this supply chain or this vendor or this product that we need to manufacture isn't going to be impacted, and we'll still be able to operate this business in a way we're expecting. So the due diligence is a little bit deeper, it's a little bit more rigorous, and it takes longer. And so due diligence in any deal, pre-COVID, post-COVID, always has some of this stuff to it. And so if you're a company looking to buy or to sell, as an owner of a company, you should recognize that you're going to be in a due diligence process, and things that people can do right now is just making sure you keep your records good, you keep your contracts good, you know what contracts are in effect, which ones are expired, because your insurance policies, everything sort of about your business, your employee lists, who, how much you pay them, how long they've been an employee. All this stuff is going to be requested of you to give up in due diligence. And so the more organized you are going into a due diligence process, the quicker it can be. And it makes you look better. It makes, it gives the buyer confidence that you got your crud together.
What would you expect the typical runway to be for a seller to get ready for that kind of event?
Well, I mean, I think that question just really depends on the type of business you are. I mean, if you're a pretty small company and lean and mean and don't have many contracts, then I don't think that process takes very long. If you're a giant company with offices all around the world and hundreds and contracts, and then obviously that process takes much longer. But sort of, smaller, companies that I usually deal with here in this community, preparing for a due diligence and getting documents ready, probably, give yourself a couple weeks. And then you upload it. It's going to be a data room there. The buyer's going to ask you to upload this stuff on a data room. So having that stuff organized and knowing, here's my contracts, here's my corporate formation documents, here's my employment stuff, here's my insurance stuff, here's my intellectual property stuff. Having that just sort of organized by those topics is what you're going to be asked to do. So that's some of the due diligence stuff in deals. So it takes longer to negotiate valuation. The earnout process can be more tedious, and the due diligence process has been more tedious and has gone deeper. One of the main things that is showing up in agreements nowadays because of COVID, and what a lot of companies have experienced and have are the paycheck protection program, the PPP loans. And so that concept and that the fact that so many companies took those loans out, or the other emergency disaster loans under the CARES Act that was passed when all this happened last year, dealing with that in an acquisition is something that's going to take more time as well, and it's something that will be addressed. If because those loans are forgivable only if the proceeds are used in very particular ways. So when someone's coming in to buy you, the company is the one who has taken out the loan, and the company is the one who has to get it forgiven. So buyers are insisting that the companies take certain actions to make sure that the buyer's not stuck with a loan that's not going to be forgiven. Now, how that's typically being handled is that the SBA, the Small Business Administration, which is what has administered these PPP loans, they've created a set of guidance principles for the PPP lenders, because you have the SBA who runs the program, but you got your loan from your bank, most likely. So you have the SBA who runs it, but banks, all sorts of banks, are the ones who are the true lender. So what the SBA has decided is that in the acquisition process, if you meet certain criteria, then you don't have to go and get SBA approval. So that, because having to get SBA approval would be very difficult, because they just don't react well and don't have resources and time to deal with me calling them up saying, hey, can you forgive Chrissy's PPP loan that she took out for her company? So they have a set of guidance and safe harbors that if you take these steps with your lender, with the bank, then the SBA will have deemed to have granted permission for the acquisition. Because the loan itself, your PPP loan, if you look at your loan documents, it says you can't sell, you can't do anything without the SBA consent. So So what lenders are doing and what you have to do now is basically you have to put the amount of your loan in escrow with the bank that lent you the money. And that stays in escrow with the lender bank until this is by the way, any unforgiven amount of loans. So if you have already got the bank to forgiven loans, then you're fine. I'm talking about loan amounts that is still unforgiven by the bank. So you put any amount that's unforgiven, you put in escrow with the bank, and the bank holds it until it's forgiven. If it's not forgiven, then the bank already has the money in escrow, so it just takes it. If it is forgiven, the money is released back to you as the owner. So this escrow process with the lending bank, again, just adds time because you're introducing a third party, you're introducing a bank to come into your acquisition process to say like, hey, I'm going to be selling. I need you to enter into an escrow agreement with me. The good news is the banks that I've seen so far here in Reno have the process down pretty good. They have their form escrow agreement. Obviously, if you have a good relationship with your banker, that's pretty key because then they can jump on it and get you the documents and you fill it out and they can shepherd the process through pretty quickly. I've seen instances where people haven't had relationships with their banks and again, just trying to get someone to pay attention to you when you're in the middle of acquisition to create a set of documents and enter into agreements, an escrow agreement with you, sometimes can just take extra time. So that is, again, the overall theme in what COVID has done to deals is just made things longer.
Would you say, what's the split between equity sales and asset sales?
What's the split?
How many deals are based strictly on asset valuations versus equity deals?
Right. I mean, I've been doing more asset deals. Probably 75% have been asset deals and 25% have been stock deals or equity deals right now. I think companies are interested. Like I said, the deals that are happening are typically larger companies buying smaller companies because of synergistic purposes, like just add-on value, that this small company is in our space and we can add it in and fold it into our, better, bigger, well-oiled machine and get that economy of scale. So because of that dynamic, the bigger companies, smaller companies, a lot of times when it's that dynamic, the bigger companies will want to do asset deals. And especially, again, because of COVID, with so many sort of unknowns that have occurred and with businesses being sort of disrupted and having to operate not in a normal standard procedure, I think bigger companies think that asset sales are probably safer for them from a liability perspective. So I'm seeing more asset sales right now than stock sales or equity. But I think that was the main things that I wanted to talk about, is sort of the timing and the due diligence and the valuation. Those are the main things. So I mean, if there's any sort of particular questions or any other questions, we can just sort of chat. And if it's just about deals in general, not COVID, or we can talk about that. So I'm opening it up to any sort of questions.
Hey, it's Fritz Battcher. I got a question. So how do you even time it with the bank right now to close the transaction?
Well, I mean, typically the lawyers don't time it. Typically we say that these things have to be done. And in a purchase agreement, it's going to be a contingency to close, that you have the PPP escrow agreement signed in effect. So, a lot of times it's just it's your responsibility to get it done as fast as you can.
I mean, the stock and all that's easy. It's just timing it with the bank to close it when you're talking about due diligence and stuff.
Well, typically deals take, I would probably say deals probably take, small deals probably take a month and a half, 2 months to be done, sort of from start to finish. So it takes a little bit of time to do any sort of deal. They're not happening. They're not happening overnight. Um, Big deals can take 8 months or longer to get done. So, if you're in the process and you're going to be selling and you have loans outstanding and that it's going to require bank consent. I mean, this is the case in any sort of, I mean, it could be with loans, but it can be with any of your contracting parties. It could be your landlord. Sometimes you need to get consent from a landlord to do a deal. Sometimes you need to get consent from a manufacturer to do a deal. So anytime you're bringing in a third party and are asking them to agree and consent to a transaction, it creates another element. It creates a third party that can muck things up and can draw things out and make you jump through hoops. And so again, that's part of sort of the due diligence process. If you're a company and know at some point you want to be sold, understanding your contracts and knowing that, oh, if I do undergo a change of control, this contract requires me to get consent from my vendor, because if I don't, they can terminate the contract, or my landlord, because if I don't consent from him, I'm in breach of my lease agreement. So it's the same thing with the loan agreements. I mean, those are just essentially it's a contract. Initially, when the first PPP loans came out and there was sort of a scramble for it, that those people who did have direct bankers who had relationships with people at the bank, the process obviously was much easier. I mean, if you know someone to open doors for you, then that's great. If you don't, then that's just sort of that's a customer service issue that somehow you have to figure out, how do I take it up the chain? How do I decide maybe this bank isn't the right bank for you? And if you can't get anyone to provide you the service that they're supposed to be providing.
Fritz, what do you see are some of the most common mistakes that sellers are making right now?
What sellers are making, common mistakes. Like I harped on kind of from the beginning, being prepared to do a deal is I think really important and really makes you look good. If you come into a situation and the buyer gives you the due diligence request list that basically, like I said, is going to say, produce everything about your company to us. If you can do that in an orderly manner and in a way that you're not having to dig through drawers and trying to figure out if I have a contract or not have a contract, or who my employees are, or how long they've worked for me. If you just have a good sense of organization, then that makes it, again, faster. And I think it just presents yourself in a really good light to a buyer. I think it just starts the deal off on a really good tone. So that's something I do harp on any client that's coming to me that's saying they want to sell. I say, get your house in order.
So if you're thinking of selling your business, you want to find somebody to, assuming that that's not your expertise as a business owner, you want to find somebody to help you figure out what you need to have ready when you're ready to sell.
Yeah, I mean, well, certainly I can tell you the stuff that they're going to ask for. I can tell you this is going to be, I can give you a sample due diligence request list and I'll say, you're going to get something that is 95% just like this. Once the letter of intent is signed and, you kind of have agreed on the basic terms of the deal, then the next step is due diligence. And this is what they're going to ask you to do. So, start getting this stuff in order. Make sure you know where your insurance policies are. Make sure you know where your contracts are. Make sure you know where your articles of incorporation are in your bylaws. Make sure you know what your capitalization table looks like, who your owners are, how many shares they have, what percent they own. Make sure, just, everything from your organizational documents to your contracts to your insurance. Make sure you know your IP portfolio. Do you have patents or copyrights? What are the file numbers for those if you've gotten that protection? When are any renewals due? Just having a sense of, again, that really everything about your company is going to be examined, and you're going to have to do that. So the more organized, and this is stuff that you can just do along the way. It's stuff that people don't like to do. Cleaning house is not fun, but I mean, even if you're not thinking of selling today, like having a good file of here's my organizational documents, here's my articles and bylaws and my org docs in this file, here's all my contracts in this file, here's my insurance policy in this file. Just simple organizational stuff like that, even if you're not selling, is going to benefit you. But it's amazing. It's amazing how often people neglect sort of just that simple organizational step. And so I just, I suggest people try to do that from the beginning.
Fritz, how often have you come across deals where the LOI is kind of structured already and signed, and they're at that document phase, and you realize the LOI was missing some key components?
That's probably about 25% of the time. I'd say about 75% of the time the client gets to me before the LOI is signed, and that's the ideal time to engage an M&A attorney, a corporate attorney, is before an LOI is signed, because then they can work with you to make sure the terms are what you want and you're understanding what they mean, and they can identify key terms that may not be there and things that you haven't thought of yet, and things that are going to be an issue in negotiation for the definitive document. And then it's just working with your attorney about, okay, do we want to bring this up now? Do we want to punt and just wait to negotiate this stuff until the definitive documents? There's different strategies and there's different reasons why you may want to do one or the other. And working with, again, a corporate lawyer like me, I can give you some of the pros and cons and tell you, maybe some strategies to think about. And then ultimately, you get to decide. And, but when I get an LOI that's been signed, that conversation still happens. And a lot of times you just have to go back and tell the, if you're the seller, tell the buyer that, hey, I'm sorry, I didn't have an attorney, and I hired an attorney, and he just brought up these points and we haven't addressed them. So, can we address them? And usually you can. It's usually not that big of a deal. But again, it kind of falls within the realm of looking like you know what you're doing and starting the deal off on a right foot. Having to come back after you sign an LOI and say, oh, I'm just kidding, I actually want to change this, like isn't you the best, look for you. So I try to tell people, like, talk to an attorney, get an attorney to help you before you sign that LOI.
Are either the buyer or seller, are they engaging a business appraiser for evaluation prior to the sales negotiations?
Yeah, sometimes. Yep. The answer is yes to that, because the attorneys won't be able to help you with that. People will come to me and say, well, how much is my company worth? They have no idea. Right. There are specific companies that do that. There's companies that will look at what you're doing and give you a valuation. And so that oftentimes is very helpful for an owner to have an idea of what a valuation is. It just sort of sets a stake in the sand. But then with a potential buyer, it will be negotiated. But if you can tell the buyer that, hey, well, this is why I'm coming up with, a $20 million purchase price, because I just had this third-party valuation done, and this is what they looked at. Here's the report. It certainly puts the goalpost in the area where you want it to be. If you don't have that, then you're just, you're looking at your financial statements. You're looking at, industry multiples. A lot of times that's how companies get valued, is a multiple of EBITDA for a particular industry segment. There are valuation companies that do that, and a lot of times small companies hire them to help in that process. But that would almost always be sort of pre-deal, because again, it's just giving you the idea. I don't see companies in the negotiation process with a potential acquirer say, okay, well, we'll hire a third party to value us. That I don't see happen. So it's sort of a pre-deal thing that you might just do every once in a while because you think you're going to sell yourself in the next few years or in a year or whatever time frame, and you want to know as the owner what a third party might think of the value of your company.
So when COVID raises its head, when you're looking at the revenues, it's really interesting how the different valuators treat COVID.
Yeah,
is
well,
it a complete aberration? What do you do with that?
Yeah, well, that's what I started, my talk on, was the valuation. That's typically the biggest issue in any deal, but in COVID it's been heightened because the buyers and sellers are farther apart than typically in a normal deal. In a normal deal pre-COVID, you had financial statements that were consistent. You could see trend lines. You could see what was happening. But COVID made everything, for the most part, just made everything go down. And so a buyer's concerned about that, and they're thinking, okay, how much of this is a blip? How much is it because the business itself was going to go down even if COVID didn't hit? And that valuation process, like I said earlier in the speech, is making the timeframes longer, making due diligence of those financials more rigorous, and then oftentimes leading a bigger gap than between what a buyer and seller wants than has happened pre-COVID, which then, like I said, the earnout then process and negotiations happen to bridge that gap.
The biggest challenge is for a buyer is looking at the other income line and trying to extract, what was grants or PPP forgiveness, and what is real operating revenue.
Yeah, they certainly will. They certainly look at those items and take that into account. If anyone has any questions or thinks of anything, look me up. I'm at Holland Hart. I'll be happy to chat with you anytime.